I work in the region. So with that, could we ask Lydia to come on board?
Thanks so much, Warner. Yeah, really happy to be here today to talk about the Suisan Landscapes project. So as Warner said, this project has been going for a few years, started in 2022 and actually just wrapped up at the end of last year. So this work was funded by the Delta Stewardship Council, and its overall aim was to expand the body of science and planning tools that are available as we think about adaptation planning in Suisan Marsh. Next slide, please. So just to orient us for this presentation, here we are in Suisan. It's one of the largest brackish wetlands on the west coast of North America. And its position really offers a unique transitional landscape between the saline wetlands and waters of San Francisco Bay and the freshwater wetlands upstream in the Delta. So here in the marsh, with changing management pressures, particularly looking into the future due to sea level rise, from changing inflows coming from the Delta, and also ongoing human impacts to the marsh. This project was really aimed towards building a strong science foundation that pieces together past and present functions in the landscape in order to be able to look forward and ground and guide our future management planning in that science. Next slide. So our overall approach for this work was really four-pronged. So first, as Warner just described, we conducted a historical ecology investigation. And through this, we developed spatially explicit representations of how the landscape functioned historically and what those landscape conditions were. Second, we conducted a landscape change investigation. And through this, we developed quantitative spatial metrics that allowed us to evaluate how the ability of the Suisan Marsh landscape to support a range of desired ecosystem functions has changed over time. And also through this, the goal was to lay the foundation of knowledge that would enable us in future phases of work to quantitatively evaluate opportunities to restore lost functions in the marsh. Third, this project also involved a community engagement task in which we met several times with members of a community working group in order to pull together information about diverse community priorities for the marsh, including current uses of the landscape and also perceived future challenges in Suisan. And then finally, we integrated these analyses and this information into a new version of the landscape scenario planning tool. And this is a publicly available GIS-based toolkit that enables quantitative assessments of large-scale restoration plans. Next slide. And as has been said, this was not creating an approach from scratch, but instead, this work was really modeled off of similar work that SFEI led in the Delta through the Delta Landscapes Project, which was really instrumental in defining restoration goals for the Delta. So in this project, really what we did was start by looking at past landscape conditions through that historical ecology view, analyzing change over time, and then in a forward-looking phase, combining that with an understanding of how things are expected to change in the future in order to identify strategies for landscape scale and really multi-benefit focused ecological restoration. Next slide. And as with most of our work at SFEI throughout the project, we were guided by an extensive group of management and technical advisors, and also our connections with a community working group who through the course of the work shared valuable input on community priorities and marsh uses that are not always typically represented by the management and science community. So it was really an effort to engage a broad array of perspectives in guiding the work. Next slide. So as I said, we really just completed this project at the end of December, so brand new. And I'm excited just to share a few highlights. We only have a few minutes here, so this is just a small cross-section of the work, but a few highlights from the products of this work. Next slide. So first of all, we have a hot off the press new report called A Marsh Transformed. And in this report, we summarized our historical ecology work and the landscape change maps and analyses, as well as providing interpretive text on how the landscape has changed. So after this presentation, I'll pop a link to the report in the chat for those of you who are joining virtually, and then maybe somebody who's in the in-person room can also copy that information down. Next slide. So as I said, in this report, one key thing was that this summarized our historical ecology analyses for Suisan. And so shown here, you can see our habitat type mapping from the mid-1850s. And so this historical ecology assessment intended to represent prevailing ecological conditions in the marsh in the mid-1850s. So really prior to the majority of our major Euro-American modifications to the landscape. And this assessment was based on a synthesis of hundreds of different historical sources. So those included early maps and surveys like this coast survey map shown here from 1866, also aerial and landscape photographs, botanical records, and also textual accounts. And as a product of this historical ecology assessment, the map that's shown here really shows a landscape that was dominated by large islands of tidal brackish emergent wetlands. Weaving through those islands were a network of mostly shallow subtidal and intertidal channels that provided connectivity between open water and land, as well as a high density of pans that you can see in the Western Marsh in pink. And then also not depicted in this habitat type mapping, but really important for how the marsh historically functioned and functions today, are an east to west salinity gradient from the bay to the delta, and also highly varied geomorphic settings within the marsh, which together real drivers of the distribution of historical native vegetation communities and wildlife who use the marsh. Next slide. So taking that historical mapping alongside modern mapping shown here, we developed these maps in a way that habitat types were crosswalked to one another and made comparable, allowing us to quantify changes over time from the historical landscape to today in a set of landscape patterns, landscape processes, and functions since the mid-1800s. Next slide. And so with these maps, these comparable maps as a basis, what the project did was define a set of metrics that enabled us to quantify change over time in support for a range of different ecosystem functions like marsh migration, subsidence mitigation, and support for a number of different wildlife guilds. And we didn't start from ground zero with these metrics. Instead, they really built directly from the work that SFEI developed in the Delta prior to this project. But then through the course of this work, we tailored these metrics to the characteristics of Suisan. So things like its comparatively shallow land subsidence, and also sort of the most dominant feature of the marsh, which is its really heterogeneous mosaic of managed waterfowl wetlands. Next slide. So this is a busy diagram. Don't expect you to take it all in here, but just wanted to highlight, I'll highlight a couple things from this land conversion diagram, which is derived from those maps, to really emphasize the widespread changes in some of these habitat types. So next slide. So whereas historically Suisan was largely a tidal brackish system dominated by tidal emergent wetland and tidal open water. Next slide. What we see in the marsh today is really dominated by a novel habitat type seen in the managed wetlands. So much of these habitat types were either not present historically in Suisan or present in really different ecological contexts. So these managed marshes, which are really a novel landscape, provide very important but also different habitat values than Suisan's historical tidal marshes did. Next slide. So this really just shows an image of one of those managed wetlands here on the left of the picture. And what you can see here is a mosaic of perennial waterfowl ponds, also with a variety of different emergent wetland types. Next slide. And so as I said, we used this information to develop a set of spatial metrics, and I'm really just going to highlight a few of those here. One of which is this first metric that illustrates the very high degree of habitat type heterogeneity that we see within the managed marshes today in Suisun. So the maps here show core areas of our emergent marsh habitat type in green, whereas edge areas of the marsh are shown in orange. So here we've defined the edge of those habitat patches as areas that are within 50 meters of the perimeter of one of those habitat patch edges. So here areas both within the marsh and just generally in terms of habitat function, areas of habitat close to their edge generally experience different biotic and abiotic conditions than areas that are within the core. So for instance, they may be more accessible to predators, they may be less buffered from human disturbance, and generally provide a greater degree of flow and connectivity between the species within a given habitat and those within the adjacent habitat. So what you can see with these maps is there's really been a dramatic reduction in the ratio of that core habitat area to the edge area in these wetlands, with the historical landscape shown on the left having 73% of its marsh as this core marsh area, and in the modern landscape having only 19% of the marsh within those core areas. Next slide. And so the second metric I want to highlight is really fundamental to the functioning of Suisun, and this is changes in inundation regimes, which are really key drivers of plant and wildlife patterns, as well as other processes and functions in the marsh. So the map on the left, which is our historical map, shows that much of Suisun historically experienced regular tidal inundation. So that's shown in this teal color, with areas of seasonal inundation limited to the upland transition zone in that lighter green. And then in comparison, Suisun Marsh today is dominated by non-tidal seasonal wetlands and waterfowl ponds. Those ponds are shown in the brown color, with just remnant patches and restored patches of marsh in the teal, and also a number of levied areas that remain dry throughout the year. So species that are dependent on intact tidal marsh, an example being California Ridgway's rail, for these species, the widespread conversion of tidal marsh in Suisun to manage seasonal wetlands, as well as the fragmentation of the remaining marsh habitat, really means a dramatic reduction in the extent, quality, and connectivity of that habitat. All that said, also want to emphasize that unlike in the Delta, much of Suisun Marsh is still wetted on a seasonal basis. And these managed seasonal wetlands provide really important food resources for many waterfowl species, particularly those utilizing the shallow ponds that are in the managed wetlands. They also support a number of other marsh species that live in the marshes, and additionally can provide substantial food web benefits for fish that use Suisun. Though the relative benefits of tidal wetland versus the managed marshes for fish is really still a developing body of science. Next slide. And so the last metric that I want to highlight for you today is another important process that's really transformed the landscape in Suisun, and that's elevation change, which has been driven by several processes in the marsh. So the map on the left shows changes in elevation since the early 1800s, which we developed from a reconstructed historical digital elevation model that was created for a separate project in a collaboration with RMA. And what you can see here is that much of the region has lost elevation since this historical time point. So really that's everything shown in the colors other than the darkest blue. And in these diked managed wetlands, this subsidence has been driven in part by oxidation and compaction of the peat in the absence of regular inundation, and then also in part by the removal of sediment for levee maintenance. And then the map on the right is an assessment of areas that we assume are likely gaining elevation, shown in the darkest orange, losing elevation in the lightest shade, or areas that we assume are roughly maintaining their current elevations, shown in the medium orange shade. And this map was developed from soil type and inundation pattern and habitat type information. And really what it shows is that we estimate around 33,000 acres, or around 30% of this Suisan study area, is actively losing elevation at relatively low rates compared with the Delta, but still ongoing elevation losses. And so this subsidence, both past and present, has the effect of increasing the risk of levee failures, and also importantly, limits opportunities to restore vegetated tidal wetlands without additional sediment inputs or other subsidence reversal actions. Next slide. So this was just a snapshot of a few metrics. This information and other information is summarized in the report that I highlighted. And also these analyses are made available for anyone who wants to reproduce them using the landscape scenario planning tool. So the landscape scenario planning tool, you may or may not be familiar with this tool, but it's a GIS-based tool, publicly available, that's designed to help managers and land use planners in both Suisan and the Delta compare the effects of alternative land use scenarios on a range of desired functions for ecosystems and for people. So the way this tool works is that users can define their own future visions, their own land use scenarios, and then for that given set of scenarios, the tool runs a number of spatially explicit analyses that are all packaged together in the tool related to various ecosystem functions. And then the tool outputs a set of data files and detailed reports that lets users compare how these scenarios perform relative to one another, and also how they perform relative to the historical landscape and the landscape of today. So this tool was originally developed for the Delta. It came out in 2020, and the latest version, 3.0, is now freely available to download as of January 1. So this is a brand new version of the tool into which we've integrated new and updated metrics from this project that are tailored to Suisan. Next slide. So this just gives you a little flavor of what the tool's output report looks like. So in addition to providing data layers that users can explore on their own using GIS, the tool also summarizes this information in sort of a easy to use interpreted HTML or PDF format that includes maps, it includes images, figures, textual interpretive information, and also tables that's really intended to help the user understand and interpret the outputs from the tool. Next slide. And then just to wrap up, I just wanted to note that what we have completed as of the end of 2024, we see as phase 1 of what we hope to be at least a 2-phase project. So ultimately, our intention is for these new landscape scenario planning tool analyses, and also the other information that we've compiled and synthesized through this project to be able to be used potentially alongside other data sets or other models to develop and evaluate restoration visions and really map out the landscape potential looking forward in Suisan. So comparable to work that SFEI has done in the Delta, we envision future phases of this work focusing on developing multi-benefit restoration strategies that will support desired ecosystem functions and land uses, and then using the tools that we have in the landscape scenario planning tool to assess and compare these future landscape visions and really help orient landscape planning in Suisan toward kind of a multi-benefit, historically grounded future. Next slide. So thank you for giving me the time to talk about this project. Just once again, want to acknowledge our funding from the Delta Stewardship Council, and then also really highlight the fact that this was a project with many inputs from many SFEI staff. So want to acknowledge the huge contributions from SFEI staff and present in completing this body of work. And with that, I will stop there, and hopefully we have a few minutes for questions.